So on behalf of the host committee, I would like to welcome you all to our first in-person Hong Kong engagement event since 2019. Sadly, we all know a lot more about immunology today than we did 2 years ago. More specifically, we know how inflammation, courtesy of COVID, costs lives and can ruin our health, how pandemics and quarantine can ruin our mental health, and how medical research can lose its way, potentially stigmatizing an entire country. I'm sure you, like me, have developed COVID conversation and information fatigue. So hopefully it will be a welcome relief to discuss these important themes, immunology, inflammation, medical research, and stigma, in an entirely different context. I won't repeat Professor Bullmore's biography, other than to say that no one is better placed to give us insights and perspectives around mental illness, to explain the new science directing mental health research, and to help us understand the impact of stigma and dogma on our struggle to examine dispassionately the illnesses that are so closely entwined with our sense of self. So I'm now going to catch up on my wine while Professor Bullmore does all the hard work.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Lucy, for that introduction. I hope you can all hear me clearly. One thing Lucy didn't mention was that actually my first proper job as a doctor was at Hong Kong University. I was a temporary lecturer in medicine at Queen Mary Hospital on Pok Fulam Road for a couple of years in the 1980s. And that experience convinced me of the very impressive professionalism and work ethic of the Hong Kong doctors and the tremendous good humor and stoicism of many of my Hong Kong patients who had to cope with a young foreigner with a very shaky grasp of Cantonese. So I left Hong Kong with many happy memories and a lot of affection and respect for the Hong Kong people. And it's great to be with you today virtually, but I hope in future to revisit in person. I'm going to talk, as you can see, about how science can lead us to think differently about the stigma of mental health. I hope you can see my slides. There they are, they just come up. So these are my disclosures, just so you know. And let's start by unpacking a little bit what we mean by the stigma of mental illness. I think for a lot of people, it's really a sense of shame that they have an illness that they feel ashamed about. They feel they may need to keep secret about. They may feel that if they disclose the fact that they have a mental illness, they will in some sense be blamed for it or discriminated against as a result. It makes people isolated. And that's a particular problem for mental illness because often the feeling of being apart from the rest of society is part of the experience of mental illness, but exacerbated by the stigma. They may feel excluded or stereotyped. And this is still a very big issue. Certainly in the UK, it's a very big issue. This slide, as you may be able to see, I took off the Brentford Football Club website, which is an unusual place to find advanced thinking about mental health. But I think it signifies that there is certainly more conversation about mental health than there used to be, and people are being a bit more open than they used to be about some of these issues, and that's a very good thing. But why do we stigmatize mental illness? What's the fundamental reason for that? And I think one very important point to get across, and I really took this from an essay by Susan Sontag that was published a few years ago called Illness as Metaphor. The key point is that we've always stigmatized any illness that we don't understand very well. And in her essay, she's a beautiful writer, so I've put quite a few words up here. she talks about the fantasies inspired by tuberculosis in the 19th century and by cancer in the 20th century as responses to a disease thought to be intractable and capricious. That is, a disease not understood. And here's the important piece. Any disease that is treated as a mystery and acutely enough feared will be felt to be morally, if not literally, contagious. Thus, a surprisingly large number of people with cancer, or one might say mental illness, find themselves being shunned by friends and relatives as if cancer, like TB, were an infectious disease. So, taking that as our theme, my vision is that the best way we can deal with mental illness and the stigma of mental illness is by understanding more deeply the causes. Here I've just listed some of the common fantasies that we might have just under the surface of our stigmatizing thoughts about mental illness. It's only them that have mental illness, not us. Talking about mental illness makes them worse or might make us mentally ill. Silence is safer all round. We don't know what causes mental illness, and there are no effective treatments. It's a mysterious life sentence and always will be. And finally, it's all in the mind, so it's somehow their personal fault or weakness that makes them ill. Now, I would argue that all of those are examples of the stigmatization of mental illness, and all of them are wrong. I'm going to just show you a little bit of data here to argue against the common fantasy that it's them that have mental illness, not us. You can see on the left there the infographic highlighting the very common prevalence of mental illness in the United States. So it's estimated 5 American adults, 20% obviously, experience mental illness at some point, and 1 in 20 will experience serious mental illness. The way I like to think about it, assuming that every family constitutes 4 or 5 people, is that every family in the States, and I think every family in the world, is touched to some extent. And I put up there a picture of somebody who I think has really played a very stigma, Sir Antonio Rosario, who, as many of you will know, took a period of sick leave for exhaustion from his role as chief executive of Lloyd's Bank Group back in 2011. But I think what was really remarkable about this man is that he spoke up. He said he was quite clear why he'd taken sick leave. And when he returned, he made it part of his leadership of Lloyd's Bank to introduce new mental health resilience programs for all the staff. And he was very successful in resuming his leadership role and leading Lloyd's to exceptional performance in the years following. So I think he symbolizes can take a bolder stance to help address these issues. But what I want to focus on more scientifically is the stigma or stigmatic idea that it's all in the mind, because it's simply not true. And I thought I'd start with this picture of a patient that I saw. This must have been a few months after I came back from Hong Kong, actually, back in the 1980s. This is a woman in a medical outpatient clinic. You can see she had rheumatoid arthritis, a disorder of the joints, and you can see the swollen joints in her hands. And I talked to her quite a bit about her joint disease, but she also said that she was feeling low, she was lacking energy, she felt gloomy about the future, and it was quite obvious that she was depressed. And I remember talking to the consultant in charge of her case at the time and saying, you know what, I think this lady with rheumatoid arthritis is also depressed. And he said to me, well, you would be, wouldn't you? You would be depressed if you were coping with rheumatoid arthritis. Now, what he meant by that was her depression isn't really anything to do with her physical disease. It's just the way she's thinking about it. It's all in the mind, and she maybe needs to take a more optimistic view about the future. But we can't think about her mental symptoms, her depressive symptoms, as part of the same disease process that's causing her joints to be inflamed and swollen. Now, that attitude, that insistence that mind and body are separate, actually goes a long way back in Western medicine, at least as far as Descartes in the early 17th century, who came up with this philosophical idea that still permeates Western medical thinking, the idea of dualism, that each of us is essentially two completely different types of thing. We are a physical body, which obeys the laws of physics and is experimentally tractable, mathematically analyzable, and we are also a mind or a soul, as Descartes would have put it. And that is supposed up. And that is, to be honest, still an area where a lot of work is ongoing in terms of research. But one of the more concrete examples of that dualistic split in how we think about the body and mind is directly relevant to the experience of the patient I was talking about earlier. As I think you can see on this slide, when we were talking about physical and mental illness back in the 1980s, it was impossible to believe that an immune disturbance in the body, such as might cause arthritis, can have anything to do with the mind or the brain, because we were taught that there was a blood-brain barrier, a bit like the Berlin Wall in the brain, which prevented the immune cells and the inflammatory proteins in the blood, shown here in the bottom of the slide, couldn't get into the brain, couldn't have an effect on the mind. It was taught to medical students as a matter of fact that the brain was immune privileged and the blood-brain barrier would prevent any interaction between the body and the mind through the immune system. Now, one of the great things about science and why I think it is such a powerful weapon against stigma is that science advances and we can change our mind as we know new things. And one of the things that we've learned over the last several years is that we're taught. In fact, there are many different channels of communication between the immune system and the brain. There are many ways in which inflammation of the body can get into the brain. It can stimulate own immune cells to generate an immune response. And those inflammatory reactions can have adverse effects on the brain circuitry, the individual nerve cells, and the larger scale networks that are so important for cognition, for emotion, and for mental illness. So some of the work that we've been doing in Cambridge recently has really been focusing on the brain in particular, and with current brain imaging techniques, we can of course see the brain in great detail, and we can analyze the pattern of connections between different elements of the brain. So we can take these images and think of them as networks, highlighting the complex web of interactions between different brain regions. Now, that may seem complex, and of course, you know, the brain is complex, but actually its network organization has quite a bit in common with a network that I'm sure many people in the room will be familiar with, and that's the airline network, shown here on the left. So if you look at the pattern of flights between different airports, you can see, for example, that there are certain key hub airports. Hong Kong would be one of them. Heathrow or JFK would be another. These are airports which mediate a lot of flights, particularly a lot of long-haul flights, and we call them hubs in the airline network, and there are hubs also in the brain network. There are particular brain regions that are especially important for connectivity across the rest of the brain. And by combining these kind of advanced imaging techniques with measurements of we can show, for example, as seen here on the left, and this is a brain looking down from the top, we can see that there's a pattern of connections that are abnormal in patients with depression and high levels of inflammation. And we can see that again on the right, where I'm showing you that the brain network connectivity in particular hubs of that network is reduced as people are more inflamed. As the amount of inflammation that we can measure in the blood increases, it changes the connectivity of hubs in the brain network. So this is beginning to help us bridge the gap between the body, the brain, and the mind. But we still have other questions about the relationship between inflammation and depression. Why do people become depressed when they're inflamed? Now, there are evolutionary theories to explain that. And one of them is that back in the old days, when we were all cavemen, one of the very common causes of mortality would have been infection, and one of the versions would have been trauma. And you can see this little cartoon, caveman has had his hand wounded in a fight. The inflammatory response may have prompted a change in his behavior. He may have withdrawn from contact with other members of the tribe. He may have changed his eating and sleeping behavior in a way that we would now regard as depressed, but might have conferred an advantage for survival back in those ancestral times. And if these evolutionary ideas are correct, we'd expect to find that the genes that put us at risk of mental illness also have a part to play in the immune response. I think this is a very exciting area of research for the future. The genetics of mental illness are only just becoming clear. It's taken a long time to get big enough samples to ensure that we know important for depression, schizophrenia, and other disorders. But as we do, we are beginning to see also that many of those genes are important for the brain, as you'd expect, and they're important for the immune system. So we're beginning to see how the genetics and the neuroscience and the immunology of mental illness can come together. And there's one final piece which I think is really important, and that is understanding the role of stress. We know that social stress, particularly early in life, is a very common predisposing cause of mental illness. We can now also recognize that stress can drive inflammation. The body reacts to social stress in a somewhat similar way to the way it reacts to a biological stress, like an infection. There is an inflammatory response. So the social stresses that we know can predispose to mental illness may work through increasing inflammation, and there are other potential causes of inflammation, but stress is certainly one of them. And as I've shown you briefly, inflammation can change the way the brain works in a way that could increase the risk of mental illness. So this is, I think, quite a different way of thinking about the cause of mental illness. It's not saying it's all in the mind, it's saying we have to think about the mind, brain, and body all together, and we have to think about that sort of more holistic view of each patient in their social context. Now, as we advance along these lines, I hope we're going to get to a new generation of treatments, a new way of treating mental illness, so that when a depressed patient comes into a clinic to see a psychiatrist, we're not immediately prescribing the same antidepressants or the same psychotherapy. Instead, we're going to take a moment and we're going to try and understand the cause of depression or anxiety, whatever it might be in that particular patient. That might involve doing blood tests, measuring biomarkers, so we can more precisely identify which patients are depressed for which reason, and we can then target treatment to focus on the causes rather than the symptoms of mental illness. That would be a huge advance. It would bring psychiatry up to the same standard as almost every other area of medicine, treating the causes rather than the symptoms. So with that, I'll finish with a few quick take-homes. And just to bring it back to stigma, the root cause is fearful ignorance of the causes of mental illness. Science, I believe, is our best way forward to really change the way we think about mental illness. And I've offered inflammation as a cause of depression as an example. But there are many other scientific techniques emerging now which can be combined to give us a deeper understanding of the complexity of interactions between the mind, brain, and the body. As we do that, as we understand causality more deeply, we will deliver new and better treatments, not just interventions, but conceivably preventions, ways of stopping mental illness from emerging in the first place. And knowing that's the future, we in Cambridge are organising, particularly around the concept of Cambridge Children's, a new regional health centre for children and young people, to do the science that will scientifically challenge the mindset of stigma. And finally, Lucy was kind enough to mention my book. This is a picture of it. It's also been published in Chinese, should you prefer to read it in Chinese. And I've just finished with the final few sentences from the book. We could be on the cusp of a revolution. It won't be televised. And I might be wrong, but I think it has already begun. And I hope with your help, we'll be able to take it even further and even faster. Thank you very much.
So a big thank you to Ed for a great presentation. I'd feel a bit better if I'd actually finished reading the book before I'd agreed to do this public speaking, because the big thing in the book, that the biggest social stressor causing inflammation is public speaking. And given the slightly, tantalizingly iffy Wi-Fi that seems to be going on in Cambridge, that was made a lot more stressful. But we got through it with no great problems. We now have about 25 minutes for questions.
Well, thanks very much for that question. We have been looking at the impact of COVID on children and young people. We, for many years, ran a research study looking at adolescents. And we had a cohort of a couple of thousand young people who'd all completed mental health questionnaires before COVID hit. And then we were able to repeat the questionnaires. It was about 2 or 3 months into the first period of lockdown in the UK. So that was about June last year. And those results showed us quite clearly that there's no doubt COVID had a major impact on mental health. We could see significant decreases in many measures of mental health in this cohort of young people compared to how their mental health had been before COVID. Now, is that because of the greater exposure to technology? Is it because of loss of social contact? Is it because of disruption of schooling, reduced employment chances? There could be a number of different factors playing in there. But there's certainly no doubt that the pandemic and the social response to the pandemic has had a big impact. And I fear that it may take some time for us to really understand the full implications of that, particularly if you think about the impact on education. It could be a while before we see how that plays out in terms of young people's achievements and training in the longer term. To that, I would add that there's another aspect of COVID, which is more directly relevant to people who've been infected, because everything I've just said is based on people who've not necessarily been ill with COVID, but they've just had to change the way they live. But if you look at what's happening with long COVID and the very large number of people that have quite persistent mental health symptoms, often fatigue, difficulty in concentrating, or brain fog, anxiety. These are very common symptoms in people for some months after the infection has largely resolved in the lungs and other parts of the body. And I think we're also very actively involved in research to understand in more detail what the causes of those long COVID symptoms are. And you won't be surprised to hear that I'm particularly interested in the idea that the long COVID syndrome has something to do with the brain, the body's immune response to the infection, and maybe the high levels of inflammation that we see in response to the virus infection are relevant to the long-term mental health outcomes. Well, I mean, the short answer is we're in a much better place than we used to be. Because we've known for generations that mental illness tends to run in families. There is a heritability of mental illness. But we've only quite recently gone the very important next step to figuring out what are the particular genes that drive that heritability. And it's taken a long time because it's taken big numbers. We've had to accumulate data on tens or indeed hundreds of thousands of cases and compare those genetics to the genetics that we see in equally large numbers of people without a diagnosis of mental illness. And that has required a huge international effort. But very excitingly, it is now bearing fruit. So, for example, in relation to schizophrenia, we now know that there are at least 300 genes that increase the risk of schizophrenia. And people now are beginning to acquire similar sized data sets for major depressive disorder, for bipolar disorder, for autism, and for many other mental illnesses. I think this is incredibly important and exciting for the field because genetics is really the root anchor point for so much modern medicine. And it is very exciting to know that we can at last talk about the genetics of mental illness in the same way that we can talk about the genetics of many other disorders. One of the things that we're learning as a result is that the genetics don't necessarily play by the diagnostic rule book. So, the diagnostic framework in psychiatry, the difference between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, for example, is defined in terms of clinical symptoms. But when you look at the genetics, it turns out that some genes can increase your risk of both bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Other genes seem to be more specific to one disorder or the other. So my anticipation is that as we get more genetic data, we understand more completely what it means, it will disrupt the diagnostic framework that we started from. So I mentioned that I think we're in a sort of revolutionary phase of psychiatry. And I think one of the things that we will see change quite radically over time as we understand the causes of mental illness, the genetics in particular, as we understand that more deeply, I think it will change the diagnostic framework. I think it will change the labels that we apply to patients currently. So I hope that's a kind of an answer. I think it's a very exciting moment, but I don't think the genetics is going to prove that everything we knew up until now was correct. I think it's going to disrupt us, push us into new ways of thinking about how we diagnose, how we label people with mental illness. There is certainly a lot of interest in inflammation in relation to not just Alzheimer's, but many other neurodegenerative diseases. And you may have heard about or read about the changes that happen in the brain of people with Alzheimer's. You may have heard of plaques or tangles. Amyloid is a protein, an abnormal protein that's deposited in the brain in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And a lot of the focus therapeutically has been on trying to clear amyloid or to treat amyloid as if that was the root cause of Alzheimer's disease. And one of the angles that's emerged more recently is that, yes, there is amyloid deposition. Yes, these abnormal proteins appear in the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease. And also the immune system sees these abnormal proteins as if they were infections, really, as if they were germs. So there is an initial deposit of these abnormal proteins, which stimulates quite a strong inflammatory response in the brain. And that inflammatory response may exacerbate, may make the disease process of dementia worse and more aggressive. So there's a lot of evidence for that accumulating, and there's a lot of interest, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, in developing new anti-inflammatory approaches that could help decelerate or slow down the rate of neurodegeneration. I think that's going to be a very important area. And it's certainly an area where you can already see there's a lot of investment going in to new drug discovery.
Can we all please thank Ed for so generously donating his time? I think it was a great talk and very close to my heart. So thank you very much. So my sneaky final question is also to kind of inform discussion, hopefully over dinner. As the host committee, we have been exploring ways of better focusing our efforts to take advantage of our unique position and perspective in Hong Kong, really looking at whether we can organize these events better or organize the structure around these events a bit better. And as food for thought, the Wellcome Trust has 3 priorities at the moment: mental health, climate change, and infectious disease. China engagement is crucial if we are to have any chance of solving these 3 really important threats. And certainly if we're going to solve them in a way that benefits everyone. I think if we maybe, as the Hong Kong engagement, focused on these 3 subjects as far as funding goes, we could do a lot of good. My feeling is, how could we not want to help? And how could this not be the right time? And I wonder if Ed had any thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's very exciting that the Wellcome Trust has made mental health a kind of key priority. And actually, it's great to see that mental health is really rising up the agenda of many funding agencies. I do think it's going to need an international effort, and it's going to need a long-term effort. We're obviously doing things in Cambridge that I think are going to be important for the future. I briefly mentioned Cambridge Children's. I think that's a very important strategic play for us, developing a new facility that will bring together mental and physical healthcare for children and young people and help us understand the causes of mental illness as they sort of play out over the course of each child's life. So that's a very important thing that we're doing in Cambridge, but we're not going to be able to succeed entirely by ourselves. We need to work in partnership with the rest of the global research community, and China and Hong Kong are certainly very important parts of that community. We have a number of interactions already with Hong Kong. My colleague, Professor Rowich, I think was out in Hong Kong before COVID as a distinguished professor of pediatrics at Hong Kong University, for example. We have partnerships going on with Hong Kong University and with other universities in China. And I think that's going to be really important to change the way the whole world thinks about mental illness, and to draw in the talents and resources of the whole world to make a difference to this very important challenge for the future.
Thanks, Ed.